to order. Welcome to meeting number 128 of the House Common Standing Committee on Fisheries and Oceans. This meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the standing orders. Before we proceed, I would like to make a few comments for the benefit of witnesses and members. Please wait until I recognise you by name before speaking. For those in the room, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel. Please address all comments through the chair. Before we begin, I would like to ask all in-person participants to read the guidelines. It's only us as in-person, so I don't need to go through that, do I? Pursuant to Standing Order 108.2 and the motion adopted on February 28, 2024, the committee is resuming its study of derelict and abandoned vessels. Welcome to our witnesses. We have on Zoom Roberta Bowman, Executive Director of the Ladysmith Chamber of Commerce, and Chloe Dubois, Executive Director of Ocean Legacy Foundation. Thank you for taking time to appear today. You will each have 5 minutes or less for your opening statement. Ms. Bowman, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Chair and committee members. Thank you for allowing me to speak on the pressing issue of the derelict and abandoned vessels. I come to you today from Ladysmith, Vancouver Island, on the traditional territory of the Stamous First Nation. Derelict and abandoned vessels directly impact our community, economy, and environment. Over the past several years, I've seen firsthand the impact of abandoned vessels in Ladysmith waters. As a coastal community, we depend on healthy waterways for local fisheries and tourism. As a boater, I've sailed from Croatia to Vancouver, visiting 150 ports worldwide, and nowhere have I encountered the level of derelict boats we see here in British Columbia. Our waters are littered, and it's a growing concern. Abandoned vessels leak oil, fuel, and chemicals, harming marine ecosystems and endangering fish, marine mammals, and coastal wildlife. These pollutants threaten our environment and compromise the health of waters essential for fishing and tourism. Our waterfront is a vital community asset, essential for residents and attracting visitors. However, abandoned vessels create ongoing challenges, deterring tourists, boaters, and recreational users, and projecting an image of neglect that harms our local tourism industry. Abandoned vessels pose serious safety risks, blocking channels and creating hazards for boaters. Sunken boats also make anchoring and navigation difficult. In Ladysmith, an area known as Dogpatch is especially impacted, with many boats abandoned or occupied by individuals facing housing, addiction, and mental health challenges. This safety concern is troubling, especially given its proximity to Transfer Beach, a cherished community waterfront. As a community, we cannot solve this problem alone. Stronger collaboration between local governments, provincial authorities, and federal agencies is essential. However, I believe a comprehensive, multi-pronged approach is necessary to address the root causes and derelict vessels in British Columbia's waters. While the initial steps are appreciated, they are not enough. Canada needs a proactive, sustainable, and comprehensive strategy that goes beyond addressing existing abandoned vessels and focuses on prevention and accountability. A national strategy would ensure all regions, communities, and stakeholders are united in addressing, removing, and preventing abandoned vessels in Canadian waters. This approach is crucial for preserving our environment, supporting our local economies, and respecting Indigenous rights to hunting, fishing, and food security. Recommendations from the Ladysmith Chamber of Commerce. We believe the Government of Canada should adopt a national strategy based on 3 principles: identification, removal, and prevention. Here are our key recommendations: collaboration and stakeholder engagement, improved system for vessel owner identification, adjust fees to cover vessel disposal costs, establish a vessel turn-in program, promote recycling standards and innovation, funding support for salvage services in local and Indigenous communities, and streamline the disposal process. The expected benefits of a national strategy would be environmental protection, community safety, and economic support, and Indigenous rights and food security. At the end of the day, derelict vessels are not just an eyesore, they represent a serious risk to our environment, our economy, and the safety of our residents. I urge the government to take action by creating more robust programs for vessel disposal, increasing funding for their removal, and fostering cooperation between all levels of government and local stakeholders. With the national strategy, I believe we can protect our precious coastal resources and ensure future generations can enjoy the beauty and bounty of our waters. Thank you for your time and consideration. I'm happy to answer any questions or provide further insights on this issue. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you for that. We'll now go to Madame Dubois for her opening statement of 5 minutes or less. And then I'll go to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Chair. Good day, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity to speak with you all. I'm calling in today from the unceded territory of the Musqueam First Nations in Richmond, British Columbia. Ocean Legacy has been cleaning shoreline and ocean environments for the last 10 years and have been working incredibly hard to develop industrial-scaled best practices that work to restore ecologically and culturally sensitive coastal environments, from shoreline marine debris, subsurface ghost gear, derelict vessels, and through derelict aquaculture removal. Our team works incredibly closely with Indigenous and coastal communities to develop project plans together, which remove large amounts of solid waste pollution and then work to recycle and reuse as much of the recovered material as possible. We work alongside First Nation communities to help restore critical traditional food harvesting areas, culturally significant areas, and help collect, collate, and share important data resulting from the survey and removal work. To date, we have removed over 30 vessels along the coast of British Columbia and know that there is a lot more work to do to remove the countless remaining. According to estimates from a 2015 study, over 1,500 derelict vessels are listed to be on the Canadian Pacific coast alone, with over 4,500 across the country. However, these are just the vessels that we can see on the surface. And as underwater surveys and restoration efforts continue to grow, we expect these numbers to increase exponentially. We have seen firsthand how destructive these vessels can be, leaking oils and fuel, resins, plastics, black waters, heavy metals from bottom paint and vessel construction, polystyrenes, asbestos insulation, chemicals, and other anthropogenic debris into the water. If it doesn't sink or leach into the water, it will then concentrate and wash ashore. When these materials concentrate along shorelines, they then break up into millions of tiny fragments, entering the food chain and impacting the habitat, health, and safety of all species. We have found that cleaning up these vessels can be very time-consuming and financially demanding due to the required permitting processes that is mandatory for removal, alongside the complex aquatic environments that then we must navigate once these vessels have sunk. It becomes further challenging as databases are often not up to date, as vessels are easily traded, sold, and owners retire or pass away, often leaving vessels to become derelict and the registry not up to date. We need to be able to address and remove and prevent these vessels from sinking and allow them to not become hazards, subsurface hazards. We have found vessels that once they have sunk, ropes, nets, and other debris become entangled with these structures, creating very dangerous environments for wildlife, which entangle and often become a hotspot for ghost gear, resulting in emaciation, vessel strikes, and drowning. These submerged vessels often create high risk for subsurface vessel strikes, creating dangerous navigable waters for vessels across the coast that are then uncharted. Hitting a submerged vessel with a vessel not only risks injury to the persons on board, but also poses the risks of adding another vessel to the list of derelicts. We have personally received countless reports from commercial divers that in areas where derelict vessels lay, there are often 3 or more other vessels stacked in the same place, one on top of the other. The introduction of the Wrecked, Abandoned, and Hazardous Vessel Act, created in 2019, was a great start in addressing the derelict vessel program on this coast, but it is not enough, and the funds available compared to the immediate need of removal costs fall short. The funds that have been provided by the province of British Columbia through the Clean Coast, Clean Waters program have also been an incredible resource. However, continuation of these funds has not been announced. We need more physical resources allocated to this problem urgently to continue to survey areas and perform removal. The government should also consider creating some concessions in terms of modifying the removal permit process when vessels are destroyed on shorelines and are actively polluting the environment. We have found dozens of vessels that are beached, are ripped apart, and actively contributing toxic pollution to environments, but then we are not legally allowed to do anything about it without undergoing an incredibly extensive review and consultation process. This often results in the vessels having to remain in place because of constricted grant funding timelines that restrict the ability to undergo such administrative processes. Addressing this issue to enable cleanup crews to remove these acute sources of pollution when they are discovered during cleanup operations would be extremely beneficial. Thank you for the consideration today and opportunity to speak with you all about these important matters. We look forward to continuing to work on these pressing matters together. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for that. And before I go to Mr. Small, I neglected to recognise Mr. Kellaway before I started opening statements. He had his hand up. So, Mr. Kellaway, when you're ready, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to put forward a motion. I move that upon tabling of the supplementary estimates B for the fiscal year 2024-2025, the committee invite Minister Leboutillier to testify on the supplementary estimates B by no later than the end of the current supply period. The rationale for it is that the Conservatives are actively stalling the SUPs from being adopted in the House of Commons, and we believe that that's going to have an impact on real key essential services like the Coast Guard and CMP to operate effectively. These services are absolutely important, and we think that it could play a role not just in safety, but ceasing a lot of operations with respect to harvesters. And we'd like to have the minister come in and speak to that and the impact of the stalling with respect to the Canadian fisheries writ large and harvesters. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Arnold.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I somewhat agree with Mr. Kellaway. It would be good to have the minister appear on the estimates and to hear what is being done. Counter that it's the Conservatives that are stalling. It's the Liberals that have been ordered by the majority of members of Parliament to produce documents. They have not done so. Thus, it is the Liberals who are actually stalling the government process. But I would like to make an amendment to the motion at the end so that it reads, the committee invite Minister Leboutillier to testify on the supplementary estimates B for a minimum of 1 hour by no later than December 4th. And I say that because of the uncertain calendar that we're always faced with as we move into December. The current supply period could be deemed as December 17th would be the final sitting day for this committee. I'm unsure whether we would actually be coming back for it simply a Monday and Tuesday in mid-December, and also with the week prior to that being questionable. That's why I proposed December 4th. So the meeting would read that the committee invite Minister Leboutillier to testify on the supplementary estimates B for a minimum of 1 hour. Actually, I'll make that the minister appear for 2 hours by no later than December 4th, 2024.
Okay, Mr. Small.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I echo what my colleague, Mr. Arnold, just said. These documents need to be produced in Parliament that the majority of members of Parliament have asked for, and you know, and then things can get back to normal and we can proceed. But it's Mr. Kellaway's party, unfortunately, that's causing this backlog in Parliament. It's a very simple thing to produce these unredacted documents on the Green Slush Fund, which I'm sure you, Mr. Chair, would love to see as well, given your support for this side of the table here. So yeah, and 2 hours would be an appropriate amount of time for the minister to appear, since Mr. Kellaway highlighted the importance of her appearance here and the fishing industry, I'm sure, would love to hear from her again. Thank you.
Mr. Bragman.
Well, just to further comment on the original motion plus the supplement to it, I think it's been very clearly established over the, I would say, the beginning stages of the debate within the House of Commons as it relates to the statement that was made by Mr. Callaway that it's abundantly clear. The Speaker has ruled the documents should be released, and that right now the government is standing in violation of the Speaker's decree as it relates to a majority vote that was held and passed by all parties in the House except for one. And I think it would behoove, our friends on the other side to take that into consideration before casting aspersions upon members of the opposition for doing our job and holding the government to account on this matter. So just to reiterate, Mr. Chair, I think it's very important that it is clearly understood that the reason why certain things are held up in the House is because those in the governing side of the House have not released the documents at this point. So release the documents, I think everything speeds up quite quickly. So I wanted to just add my voice to that, and then also further support the call for the minister to come by December 4th, because who knows with the activities of the House when we will actually adjourn for Christmas. Let's make sure she has opportunity to come and address the committee and do it in detail. 2 hours is good time, and it would be great to have her come and share. I'm sure the harvesters across the country would appreciate that, and those in the fishing industry and coastal communities would as well. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Ms.
Chair.
Barron.
Oh, thank you. I was going to call a point of order, but that works out well. It's my turn anyways. I just wanted to ask for unanimous consent from the committee if I know we're in a motion, but I guess so it's more of a point of order here around if we can extend the meeting to make sure that we get all of our questions in. We do go into a closed business committee after this meeting, and I want to make sure that we get the fulsome questions to our witnesses that are here. And so I wanted to ask unanimous consent that we continue on until all of our pre-planned questions have moved forward due to the fact that we've had some delays in getting started here.
Okay. Agreed? No?
No problem.
Oh, okay. I thought you said no. I heard the no part. I didn't hear the problem. Okay, so that's fine. Now, Mr. Morrissey.
Chair, first, the amendment proposed by Mr. Arnold, I don't have a problem with. But what I do have a problem is the continued hypocrisy coming from the official Conservative opposition, who chooses to editorialize the Speaker's ruling selectively to suit their particular agenda, which is to delay the House. And at a time when we hear consistently from them on this particular ministry the urgency of and the importance of protection, funding for enhanced protection, as well as the Canadian Coast Guard, that would hide behind selective editing of a Speaker ruling that does not really say what the official opposition likes to interpret. But that's not that has not gone unlost on the Canadian public. But as far as the motion or the amendment of Mr. Arnold, of course, any time. And I must say, if you look at the record, ministers of fisheries have appeared before this committee in greater frequency than they did in 9 years of the former Conservative government, just for the record, if you're wanting to choose that. But Mr. Chair, the amendment of Mr. Arnold I'm okay with.
Mr. Arnold.
Just for the record, as Mr. Morrissey stated, and I did previously state, that it was an order of the majority of the members of Parliament that the government produce the documents. The government has failed to produce those documents. That's why the Speaker made the ruling that he did. So if we have no other amendments or discussion, I think we can go to the question on the amendment.
Okay. Madam Clerk.
Ms. Koutrakis.
You're on mute.
Oui. Mr. Weiler.
In favor.
Mr. Hardy,
No.
Mr. Kellaway.
In favor.
What did he say? In favor?
Yes.
Okay. He said what?
Yeah.
Nay
Heard he said nay.
and yea. Mr. Morrissey. Mr. Arnold.
Yes.
Mr. Bragdon.
Yes.
Mr. Zimmer.
Yes.
Mr. Small. Madame Desbiens. Ms. Barron.
Yes.
10 yeas, 1 nays.
Okay, now we'll go to the motion as amended. When you're ready.
Ms. Koutrakis.
What shuffle? Shuffleboard. The amended motion.
Yes, she did.
We.
Mr. Weiler. Mr. Hardy. Mr. Kellaway.
It's hard to follow that up. That's a yes. Yeah,
Mr.
that's
Morrissey.
a yes.
Way back in the room.
Yeah.
Mr. Morrissey.
Yes.
Mr. Arnold.
Yes.
Mr. Bragdon.
Yes.
Mr. Zimmer. Mr. Small.
Yes.
Madame Desbiens. Ms. Barron.
Yes.
11 yeas, 0 nay.
There you go. The motion as amended has passed. Okay, now we'll go back to our round of questioning. Mr. Small, you're up for 6 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the Pardon me, Chair.
Leave your soup in that bowl.
Could you tack that time onto my?
No.
Thank you. Well, no surprise.
It's your bowl.
I'd like to thank the witnesses, in spite of the chair's interruption, for coming here today to this very valuable study. To Ms. Bowman, first of all, these waters are littered by members of the public. You know, when the mining industry or some other type of industry leaves their junk behind, they're forced to clean it up by the government. So, how much onus should be on the government to clean up garbage that's left behind by the general public?
Through the chair, thank you, Mr. Small, for your question. I totally agree. The owners, the public should be cleaned up after themselves. Here on the West Coast, we do cleanup days multiple times a year. There are shore volunteers that go out, multitude all over BC, and they clean up the shores. So, and it's all volunteer, and they go out and they clean up the shores of all of the remnants that you were discussing. So, and more does need to be done, definitely. I know that, there's a lot of impact changes, people going from plastic straws to paper straws, things like that, to help mitigate that as well. So I think it's an ongoing issue that people are really focusing on. Thank you, Mr. Small, through the chair.
Thank you very much. We've heard testimony, Ms. Bowman, as well, that it seems like the derelict vessel problem is it's increasing as time goes on, as more people realize that they can leave their derelict vessels behind, abandoned, and the ownership not traced. Even people who are paying attention to this study are going to realize that it's easier to do this than what they might have thought before. What do you think can be done to slow down the increase of this basically dumping in the ocean?
Thank you, Mr. Small, through the chair. I think a lot can be done. I think we need to be putting some new initiatives in place and put them back on the boat owner. I can say that I'm a boat owner, so I totally understand this situation. What's happening, with the growing increase in the cost of living these days, folks are not able to afford moorage, so they are taking their boats and they are anchoring them, and then from anchoring, then one day one thing leads to the next. Is a domino effect, and all of a sudden these boats are abandoned, and then they become derelict. So I think, and that ties into insurance. Once a boat reaches a certain age, getting insurance on a vessel is increasingly difficult with older vessels, with the increased amount of maintenance that needs to be done on them. Again, a boat is as good as it is used. The more you use the boat, the healthier it is, and not everybody knows or understands that. I've managed multiple marinas in my time, run them, and that is something we tell folks all the time. So I think it starts with boat owners and educating them on what they can do. And then I think it leads to multi-levels of government coming in and helping to put process in place. Thank you, Mr. Small, through the chair.
Thank you, Ms. Bowman, for that excellent expert testimony. Mr. Chair, my question is to Ms. Dubois. And Ms. Dubois, you spoke about how expensive removing these derelict vessels is. Do you have any suggestions for maybe creating a pool of money or drawing together different sources of funding privately to help deal with this problem, versus not placing the bulk of the onus on taxpayers across Canada, many of which have never seen the ocean? Thank you.
Thank you for that question, Mr. Small, and to the chair. I think, yeah, this work is incredibly expensive, and just to speak a little bit on your last question, it can be dangerous. So leaving this work in the hands of volunteers, I don't think is the right way to go long term. In terms of raising funds or pooling funds, we can look to models, waste management models, such as extended producer responsibility, where I know people aren't in favor of taxes or like putting a tax on something, but, creating a deposit scheme or a deposit method when at the point of purchase of the vessel could help pool funds together for that. We've also discussed looking at creating a small tax on the amount of when shipping containers come into the port, creating a small tax on each container so that that money can then be pooled together for restoration funds across the coast. So that could create a substantial fund for not only helping with the removal and funding of the removal of derelict vessels, but also many other restoration needs that are across the coast. So those are some of the mechanisms that we've explored to date.
Thank you for that. We'll now go to Mr. Waller for 6 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Chair. And I do also want to thank our two witnesses for joining in today by video conference. And I want to start with Ms. Dubois. You mentioned a few things that kind of piqued my interest. Number one, you mentioned some of the challenges with the removal permit process. Just the challenge that it takes to go through and the time that it takes to go through the review and the consultation process. I was hoping you could share a little bit more with this committee what that type of process looks like right now and what type of recommendations you might have for amending it.
Sure, wonderful. Thank you for the question. As I mentioned, this work is incredibly expensive, and I think it starts with volunteers. I don't think is the right way to go long term. In terms of raising funds or pooling funds, we can look to models, waste management models, such as extended producer responsibility, where So right now, the process, in a nutshell, what this looks like is when we come across a vessel, we have to identify the registration number, and then we have to work through Transport Canada to identify the owner. This can be quite a longer process in terms of then putting out consultation. Usually that looks like a public announcement, which then lasts, I believe, up to 60 days for somebody to claim that vessel. So when we're looking to do restoration and cleanup efforts, we have to be planning 6 months to a whole year in advance in order to align the approval of the permitting process if none of these vessels are then owned or the owners don't come forward. We have to align that with the funding that we're applying for. So either that looks like grants, oftentimes grants, or donors or sponsors that we get from the community to do this work. So it makes it challenging for us to be able to go through that administrative process and align all of the resources we need in time to be able to do the work. So after the consultation process, if no owners then claim the vessel, then we can then fill out a few other forms then to own the vessel, so that the ownership of the vessel then gets transferred to our organization. And from that point, we are legally allowed to clean up and remove the vessel. So we've encountered numerous instances where we go to clean up a vessel and underwater, so submerged, and then we remove the vessel, and then there's another vessel underneath that vessel. And we have the resources in that moment to clean up the stack of vessels, but we legally are not allowed to. So it creates an incredibly frustrating circumstance for us, where then we have to literally leave these vessels that we can see actively leaking and polluting toxins into the environment. And then we have to go through the whole process again, reapply for more funding, then get the permitting process involved. So I feel that there needs to be some sort of concessions in place where, when circumstances, extreme circumstances like that occur, there's concessions to be able to remove the vessel when we have, an expert and specialized team in place with the resources in place. We've also come across instances where we're doing extensive shoreline cleanup and debris removal. And we do extensive surveys of these areas ahead of time. However, sometimes we do come across, say, up in a forest or somewhere where we didn't, a location where we didn't initially catch the initial debris concentration from a derelict vessel. These vessels are ripped apart, shredded. They're actively leaking all kinds of pollutants. And again, we can't touch the vessel unless we go through this permitting and consultation process. And then we just have to, it's heartbreaking to see, and have to leave these vessels in place. So that's sort of a little bit of of our experience in undergoing this process.
Thank you. And that actually leads to the next question I wanted to ask. And you mentioned that the Wrecked, Abandoned, and Hazard Vessels Act was a very good start. And some of the funds that are provided through that. But you mentioned that more resources needed to be allocated to survey areas. And certainly the what you mentioned about finding these submerged vessels and kind of the cumulative impact you have of other vessels or other ghost gear that is getting attached to it is very concerning. So I think, number one, it's the need to have more resources, but I think it's also about ensuring that those resources go to surveying areas that are going to have the biggest impact, so that you're avoiding those situations that you just mentioned, where you're removing one boat and you're finding more that are there submerged. So I wonder if you have any recommendations for this committee about how those resources can be best allocated to do surveys.
That's a great question. Thank you for that question. I think to allocate the resources best, I mean, what we're seeing, and and to Mrs. Bowman's comment, with the dog patch there, but we are seeing very large concentrations outside of larger cities and urban establishments. So oftentimes we're seeing incredibly large concentrations in remote Indigenous harbor communities. So I think allocating these resources should go in the hands of the Indigenous communities, so that they can oversee. Oftentimes, they know exactly where a lot of these vessels are and where their traditional grounds and harvesting areas are being affected. So I think working more closely alongside with Indigenous stewardship is essential. And then also working with the coastal communities that can then help co-create the restoration and removal plans together. So, a lot of the Indigenous communities that we partner with to do this work, have generations of vessels underwater in place. So, and the survey work is imperative. So I think definitely partnering with these communities is the direction to go for that. So.
Thank you, Mr. Waller. We'll now go to Madame Debienne for 6 minutes or less, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci à nos
Thank you,
témoins.
Chair. Thank you to our witnesses. It's always very valuable for us to have you with us. I would like to speak to Madame Dubois. We could go back on the first evidence. We learned in 2016 that $2.2 billion were injected in the economy of the sector so that various organizations taking care of the management of ghost ships were well equipped. You said you had difficulty in being funded, that it's complicated. Did you receive some supports financially since 2016, major support?
Those comments. We have received significant support through the federal government through the Ghost Gear Fund. So we've been able to remove subsurface ghost gear as well as develop sustainable end-of-life solutions for processing this material once it's removed. But just to note, I don't think we struggled with the administration process itself. It was just the timing of the administrative process and then aligning that with the fiscal end of year and the constraints of the funding that we did receive. So what we're asking is to look when we're in the field collecting and removing vessels, to look at potentially concessions of if there are more vessels underneath those vessels, or from a shoreline perspective, if those vessels are completely ripped apart and too far gone to really, they're just polluting everywhere, to have something in place that we can quickly apply for, or like a mechanism that can then be enacted that we can then run with, instead of then having to go back to like a 6-month plus process, is what we're really asking for. And we have been funded, and we do have the ability to go through the administrative process, and we've done that repeatedly. It's just the challenges once we're in that, when we're actually doing the work, that it would be great to have some of those additional mechanisms in place. So thank you.
Merci, c'est très éclairant. On a eu aussi des témoins.
That's very enlightening. We also have witnesses, divers from Quebec Subaquatique, who opened a window on the positive side of shipwrecks when we've seen that they don't contain any hazardous materials. Even in the St. Lawrence, there are ships that are shelters for underwater life, for certain species. So does that aspect, to your knowledge, does that also exist on the West Coast?
Thank you for that question. So yes, I mean, sunken vessels can create habitat and they can stimulate biodiversity within the marine ecosystem. However, I would caution, actively leaving vessels in place until extensive survey work on those vessels have been completed. If there's no hazardous waste involved in them, the type of material and the composition of material that the vessel is made out of needs to also be considered with that. So there might not be oils or batteries or any kind of hazardous materials on board, but leaving, say, a fiberglass vessel in place that is made out of plastics, resins, could also pose photodegradation over time. So, I would say the same for tires. I know tires are often also used as substrate to stimulate underwater biodiversity growth. So those factors should be considered, as well as extensive survey work before those actions are taken.
Merci beaucoup, Madame.
Thank you very much. Ms. Bowman, you mentioned three, I wrote pillars, maybe that's not the ideal thing. So the counting, the removal of boats once they've been counted, and a prevention aspect. Your request to the committee, if we had to make recommendations about that, could you give me an order of priority? Would you have the greatest difficulty in terms of counting them, of removing them, or of prevention? How would you prioritize the financial needs of each of these aspects?
I would. I think for the current, I think there's two opportunities here. I think the first one, from a triage situation of trying to get this under control, I think would be identification and removal, and then prevention would come last, only for the fact that once we get this current situation under control of what's there, then I think prevention comes first, identification, and then removal. I say that because the vessels need to be identified. They need to be identified by the owners. And that's difficult to do here in BC, for the fact that not all. So there's two ways that a boat can be registered here in BC. One is through the registry of the Canada Registry, which my boat is, because I bought it offshore. The other way, which is the majority of the boats here, because they're pleasure crafts, pleasure boats, and that's just through a licensing process, where you would put the province, for example, would be for BC, would be BC, and then there would be a series of numbers beside it. Generally, this registration is located on the side of the boat. If a boat is going to become abandoned or derelict, those numbers, that registration, boat owners generally will remove that to make it more difficult for vessels to be identified. So I think then we need to put more onus on making a more difficult, making it more difficult for an owner to be able to remove that licensing information. The other thing is, I think we need to put the onus on, again, on the boat owner to make it more difficult to put more red tape, if you say, for lack of appropriate words, in place to make it more difficult for them to be able to just sell their boat to just anybody, because that is what's happening. They're giving their boats away to people, and they're selling them, and the new person is not registering them. So even though the boat technically hasn't been removed off of the prior vessel owner's insurance or the identification has been removed.
Thank you, Ms. Bowman. I got to end it there. We're going a little bit over time. We'll now go to Ms. Barron for 6 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Chair. And welcome to both of you here today. Ms. Bowman, if you wanted to finish your thought, I'm happy to provide you the space to do so.
Through the chair, thank you, Ms. Barron. Lost my thought. I just wanted to say that I think if we prevention, put more the onus back on, make it more difficult for owners to sell their boats. We need to put that on in a priority in my view. Thank you, Ms. Barron, through the chair.
Thank you. Ms. Bowen, I'm going to ask my next question to you. It's so nice to see you here and through the chair. And as we've already heard, there's multiple reasons why it's good to be hearing from you, both as the Executive Director of the Ladysmith Chamber of Commerce, but also as a boater and a West Coaster. There's lots of vital information that you're bringing forward today. As the Executive Director of the Ladysmith Chamber of Commerce, can you clarify some of the implications that you're hearing from businesses of these vessels being left abandoned along our coast?
The locals, it's a safety issue for sure. I'm going to use Dogpatch as an example. Folks, boat owners are leaving their vessels in Dogpatch. It's an area, it's a body of water located just right on the outskirts, right off of our Transfer Beach, which is a very popular beach in the summertime. Tourists come from everywhere. And folks they're squatting in these boats. There's drug use happening in those boats. Last spring, somebody lost their life inside of one of those boats. They weren't found for about 3 or 4 months later. So we have the dignity to humanity at that point that we really need to put that into play when, you know, a squatter sitting in a derelict boat, the boat's just sitting there and it's not being checked on. And then all of a sudden someone, you know, there was within that community, because they have their own little communities, realized that this person hadn't been seen for a few months, and then they called the authorities, went in, and sure enough, they located a body. So it's a safety issue on many levels, and I've worked at the community marina, which is located right beside Dogpatch. I ran that marina in 2019 for 6 months. And when I came home as an interim with me bringing my boat home, and we saw people from that area coming in with in full fights on drug overdoses. It's a real community issue. It's an issue for sure. Thank you, Ms. Barron, through the chair.
Thank you, Ms. Bowman. It definitely highlights some bigger issues that are also, you know, it's a compounding issue that we're seeing, all interconnected. So thank you for highlighting that. Ms. Bowman, you had spoken about the adjustment of fees in marinas. Can you share a little bit more your thoughts on that?
Thank you, Ms. Barron, through the chair. Yes, I from my personal perspective and experience on this, the marina that we are located on in Ladysmith, the mortgage fees there over the past 3 years has gone up 24%. That's a lot for those fees, and so. And in order to have a boat in a marina, you must have insurance. And as I was saying earlier, older boats, more difficult to get insurance. You do need surveys. You need an in-water survey. You need an out-of-water survey. And you need those to get insurance. And the older boats are getting more and more difficult to get insurance on these vessels. And so if no insurance, you cannot moor. And so it's a catch-22 situation when it comes to that. But I really think that if we could, I don't know how we could do this, because a lot of those marinas are personally owned, but putting a moratorium on fees in the marinas until we could get the derelict and abandoned vessel boat issue mitigated would help the situation, I think, quite a bit. I think it would be a start where people aren't looking for that next to solve the next problem of not being able to afford moorage and moving their vessels out on their anchors.
Thank you, Ms.
Thank
Bowman.
you, Ms. Bear, through the chair.
Thank you. I only have 30 seconds left. Ms. Dubois, 21 seconds. Could you answer quickly if the Ghost Scare Fund, if you're still, what's the status of that? Do you have any current applications? Is there funding available? Can you share with the committee the status of your ability to access Ghost Scare funding?
Thank you for that question through the chair. So the Ghost Gear Fund has stopped providing resources. Along the West Coast, we haven't seen resources here now for about 2 years as resources were directed to solve the effects of Hurricane Fiona. It has created a massive loss in our community. For years, we've built capacity. We've been able to train coastal community to respond to ghost gear, and now those resources are gone and there aren't any resources to replace that. So we've been calling on the federal government to reinstate the Ghost Gear Fund across Canada from coast to coast, as it has created an incredible opportunity for this country to continue its leadership in environmental stewardship, as well as marine conservation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Barron. We'll now go to our second round of questioning. Mr. Arnold, for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you both for appearing today. I'll ask Ms. Dubois first. Are you aware that vessel purchasers, the new owners, are required to register the vessel with Transport Canada?
Yes, I am aware that it is required. However, it's not always still being done, just from being out on the coast here. So,
okay, thank you. I'll ask the same question to Ms. Bowman. Are you aware that vessel owners, when they purchase a vessel, no matter what type, are required to register that vessel with Transport Canada? Register
Yes.
their ownership?
Yes. I am aware of that. The issue is that it's registered when it's a new boat with a new owner, but when the transfer of ownership happens, it doesn't always transfer over. That's the issue. It disconnects with the next owner.
It disconnects if the new owner fails to register with Transport Canada, which is something they are required to do under current legislation and regulation. But there appears to be little enforcement or little way in the way of the ability to track the resale of vessels. A new vessel sold by a manufacturer, there is a registration process that they have to go through. But when that vessel is resold by an original or even a second or third generation owner, are you aware of any onus on the seller to identify to anyone that they have sold the vessel?
Through the chair, no, I totally agree 100% that there is no onus for the primary owner to inform anybody that the boat has been sold, and that's exactly what I was speaking to, and those are the onuses that we need to put in place for each and every owner.
Ms. Dubois, I see you nodding your head. Please comment.
Sure. I completely agree with Ms. Bowman and yourself. There needs to be, the lack of enforcement and the disconnect between transferring ownership has to change, I think, to prevent or at least help continue to prevent these vessels from being abandoned, as well as enhance the tracking mechanisms that we can have available to us. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Bowman, I believe you said you operated the marina for a time. How often did you see officials actually inspecting, or how often have you heard of officials checking for registry requirements on vessels?
Through the chair, Mr. Reynolds, I can say that the only time that the RCMP went over to that area was when there was an issue that they needed to deal with. At no time did I see anybody go over to Dogpatch to review any of the boats in any way, shape, or form. And that was in 2019.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Bowman, you also mentioned serious issues of housing, mental health, addiction problems, squatting, drug use, overdoses. Have those issues compounded over recent years?
Through the chair, Mr. Reynolds, yes, I agree. I believe that it has compounded over the years, especially with our current housing crisis, increasing costs of living. More and more people are moving on to boats because it is it's shelter.
Okay, thank you. Just one more quick question. Are the people that are either squatting or occupying without permit or ownership, were they typically people that used to have homes and vessels? Did they only have a home before, a land-based property, a home, or did they only live aboard and they simply can't afford? Can you categorize what situation they might be from?
Through the chair, Ms. Reynolds, thank you for that question. I can't give you an actual answer for that. I don't know of any to date. I'd be curious. I'd like to do some research on that. Because some people have never owned a house. They've only ever lived on their boat, their liveaboards. These folks here that are squatting, I'm going to say they're just like the folks we see on the streets living in tents. They were once housed and then became unhoused. And for them, moving onto a boat, whether it was given to them, whether they just decided, this boat's been abandoned here for such amount of time that they decided to move on to it. It's a good question that I unfortunately don't have the answer to. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Reynolds. We'll now go to Mr. Hardy for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and it's good to have the witnesses here. Actually, I'll ask both, but starting with you, Ms. Bowman, are you up to speed on, the bylaws, et cetera, that are potential tools in the hands of municipalities to, set some rules with respect to, where boats are moored, how long they're allowed to stay there, et cetera, et cetera? This came to light because it seems that derelict and abandoned vessels is more of a West Coast issue than anywhere else. So it could be that we have to get creative on the West Coast as opposed to looking at, sort of pan-Canadian rules. But those bylaws, et cetera, are you aware of the capabilities of the municipality in this situation?
Through the chair, thank you for your question. I've gone to the town of Ladysmith with questions like this, and they tell me that this is a provincial and federal issue where the boats are moored in waters, and so they have no jurisdiction. So I think they feel their hands are tied. I think they would like to put bylaws in place and have some ownership of this. I think that would help them.
Thank you, Ms. Bowman. I'll have to interrupt because my time is rather short. Ms. Dubois, question for you. The manufacturers, do you think that, if we're going to have to deal with the residual effects of the problems that have been evident, in order to proactively deal with the future, are there things that manufacturers can do to, first of all, look at the materials they're using on the boats to make them more easily recyclable, because fiberglass apparently is not, and other things like hidden vessel identification numbers, things like that might actually allow an owner to be tracked down? Any thoughts on that?
Thank you for the question through the chair. I think putting a hidden registration number in place to identify the vessel would be beneficial. However, if there's a disconnect in the, tracking the ownership of that vessel, we're going to continue to run into the same problems and issues. In terms of, sorry, could you just repeat the first part of your question?
Oh, just the whole issue of what the manufacturers actually use, materials
Yes,
that could be more
thank you.
easily recycled.
Yes, for sure. So I think, this speaks to a larger problem in terms of the disconnects in our waste management systems, but having some sort of proof of a life cycle assessment analysis would be incredibly beneficial, so that full thought is given from the very beginning of the construction of the vessel to then the disposal of the vessel. This becomes complex because in each community there are different capacities in terms of waste management. So in British Columbia, we are pretty lucky in terms of the recycling capacities that we do have locally.
Okay, at that point, again, I have
yeah.
to interrupt. I'm sorry to do
no
that,
problem.
but again,
Sorry.
my time is short. We've had suggestions that one of the difficulties with respect to cleaning up derelict vessels is the fact that they're scattered up and down the coast because the process and the cost of turning them in for disposal is difficult, if not expensive. Should we basically start to set up zones where people can voluntarily surrender their vessel at no charge, but at least it makes the whole issue of cleaning these vessels up easier and less expensive? I'll ask you, Ms. Bowman, for that.
Through the chair, thank you for your question. Yes, I think that we do need to put some infrastructure in place for these boats to help mitigate this issue and to encourage people who no longer want their boat or their boats not seaworthy to hand their vessels over in a very in a good manner. Thank you, through the chair.
Getting back to you, Ms. Dubois, you mentioned the difficulties that you're having when it comes time to try and remove a vessel. What kind of red tape would you like to see eliminated to make that process a lot easier for you?
Thank you for the question, and through the chair. That's a great question. I think some of the red tape we are facing is the length of the consultation period to find the owner. We've heard today here that finding the owner can be very difficult. And then on top of when we find the owner, then sometimes it's a negotiating process with that owner to then have them agree to have their vessel removed, even though it's causing risk to public health and safety. So it would be good to have the vessel somehow assessed and to be able to remove some of that consultation process around the vessel once it has been identified. And just quickly, even when a vessel is reported as abandoned, there is very little that can be done until that vessel is actually sinking. So even when we try to prevent the issue from occurring and prevent the vessels from sinking, there's no mechanisms in place for us to actually do that until that vessel then is actually either underwater or sinking in its own right. So there needs to be some kind of mechanism that, when these vessels are reported as abandoned, almost like a fast track in order to remove them from the water before they're sinking to prevent very costly removal efforts. And then when they are underwater, fast tracking them to get them out of the water.
Thank you, Mr. Hardy. We'll now go to Madame Debienne for 2.5 minutes or less, please.
2 petites minutes, Monsieur.
2 short minutes, Mr. Chair. I have a question for Ms. Bowman. More, but maybe Madame Dubois can also answer. So we have to work on 2 aspects. The aspect of the ships that are already underwater that we absolutely have to remove, especially if they're harmful to the environment. And the other one, which is the management of the registration and licensing of these boats. So according to you, should we at committees divide these two topics and propose funding for each? First of all, have a budget for removing hazardous boats, and with another budget, have putting in place a reliable and functional registration system. Ms. Bowman, we could start with you.
Through the chair, thank you, Madame Dubois. Yes, I think that would be dividing the two. They are both so important that I think, and we've seen here today that that dealing with the ones that are they're sunk is critical, as well as management of the registration and licensing is also critical for future to mitigate future issues. So yes, I believe that dividing the two and for the funding would be a good suggestion. Thank you, Madame Dubois, through the chair.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. J'avais empiété la dernière fois,
Thank you,
donc.
Chair. I went longer last time, so I'll pass the floor to the next person.
2.5 minutes, please, or less.
Thank you, Chair. Ms. Dubois, I didn't get to mention at first, thank you for being here and, of course, for all the work that you do in this area. I wanted to ask Ms. Dubois for you to expand a little bit on the constricted grant writing and how that impacts the ability to clean up these vessels or prevent them from sinking in the first place.
Thank you for the question, Ms. Barron, through the chair. So oftentimes the grants that we're applying for are on an annual basis, and those grants are not reoccurring or committed to annually. So we need long-term committed annual funding that we can then use to perform survey work as well as conduct removal efforts that are not constricted by the end of year for March fiscal, say the end of government fiscal. You know, we find that as we're doing the work, there's, you know, we want to do meaningful consultation with First Nations communities. We want to have community engagement, and these things take time to complete it in a meaningful way. So we would like to see, you know, longer term funds available over a multi-year period that we can then utilize and continue to you know, fund and do the work.
Thank you so much. Thank
in
you.
a longer way.
Yeah, all very good points and very important for us to put forward in our recommendations. My final question to you, Ms. Bowman, do you have any thoughts around, through the chair, how important it is that we see federal leadership here, that we see a strategy that's put in place? You talked about the importance of a national approach being taken. Can you share a little bit? You talked about the onus of responsibility and, you know, and the response that you get more locally. How important is it to local Chamber of Commerce, to local communities, that we see federal leadership on this issue?
To the chair, thank you, Ms. Barron. I think it's important because it's Canada, it's federal. It's our top tier. It's where our leadership starts, and then it goes on to provincial, and then down to our municipal. And I think that if there is a collaborative from the top down, I think that would be a really good representation of leaders across the country, federally, provincially, municipally, working together to address this cause. Thank you, Ms. Barron, through the chair.
Thank you. We'll now go to Mr. Bragdon for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for appearing here today and giving very insightful testimony, and thank you for your work that you do on this. I wanted to start off by asking both of you, and I can maybe start with Ms. Dubois, and then we'll go to Ms. Bowman. But just to both of you, in your opinion, has the Wrecked, Abandoned, or Hazardous Vessels Act achieved its stated purpose? In your estimation, do you believe it is accomplishing what it is set out to do? So I'll start with you, Ms. Dubois.
Thank you, Mr. Bragdon, through the chair. I believe that, yes, it is accomplishing its initial intent. However, I think more obviously needs to get done in terms of the removal work and the resources available to do the work. So, thank you.
Hey, Ms. Bowman?
Thank you, Mr. Bragdon, through the chair. I believe that what has been put in place is a good start. As we are seeing increased boats being derelict and abandoned, I think that there is more to do. Just to example, in the last 2 weeks, 2 more boats did sink, one in Dogpatch and one just on the outskirts of Sydney and Victoria. So, and both were abandoned vessels. And I believe there is a lot more work that we can still be done. Thank you, Mr. Bragdon, through the chair.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And with that in mind, we've heard testimony here, and it seems like I'd like to get your perspective on this as it relates to there's what we call the traditional jurisdictional ping pong that oftentimes happens when it comes to this. And, oh, no, that's federal responsibility. No, that's provincial. No, that's municipal. And oftentimes the people closest to the ground are those doing the work, the organizations like yours that are closest to it say, wow, I just wish it was clearer, more succinct, so that we knew exactly who we need to be contacting, how we can start the process when we discover one of these vessels. How does it get prioritized? What is the greatest risk? Have you found in your experiences that is a big challenge that needs to be resolved, the jurisdictional ping pong, as it were? If you want to comment on that, I'll start with you, Ms. Dubois, and then to you, Ms. Bowman.
Thank you for those comments, Mr. Bragdon, through the chair. We have 100% experienced the ping pong effect. So, and that trickles over into even derelict aquaculture removal. There's often many different permitting bodies involved, and often it gets batted around in terms of who needs to pay for it, really is what it comes down to. And when there are large dollars at stake or large amount of resources needed, nobody really wants to fit the bill for that. So we have definitely been through that experience of being passed around. I will comment quickly that there is a new strategy being developed on the west coast of British Columbia called the Coastal Marine Strategy. It's the first time ever in history that this strategy, a 20-year coastal marine strategy, is being planned, co-written by coastal Indigenous First Nations. So this could be a really great opportunity to bridge all levels of government and collaboration working together through this 20-year management plan to ensure that derelict vessels become addressed in this plan and that the bridge is formed between provincial and federal levels.
So it's called the Coastal Marine Plan, is that correct?
Coastal Marine Strategy, and it's currently being developed through the Water, Land, and Resource Stewardship through the province. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And Ms. Bowman, do you want to comment on that as well about the jurisdictional ping pong? That's probably going to be the end of my time looking at the chairs. Look at me here. So if you want something quickly, you go ahead.
Through the chair, thank you, Mr. Bragdon. Really quickly, yes, I totally agree, and I think that is Dogpatch. Its growth is a good example of that, where the municipality is saying not our problem, provincial saying not my problem, federal saying not my problem. So I feel like bring all the parties together to the table to discuss who needs to be. That they need to work together ultimately. Thank you, Mr. Bragdon, through the chair.
Thank you, Mr. Bragdon. We'll now go to Mr. Waller for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Chair. I want to pick up on a number of comments that were made earlier. Ms. Dubois, you mentioned the need to have long-term ongoing funding for some of the work of removing vessels. And Ms. Bowman, you mentioned as part of your recommendations changes that you'd like to see on the fees for boats. So one of the things that the federal government has proposed is the creation of a vessel remediation fund, wherein boat owners, when they register their vessels, would be subject to paying a small fee that would go into this fund that would, over time, be able to have a sustainable source of funding to do this type of work. So maybe first Ms. Dubois, then Ms. Bowman. I'd love to hear your thoughts on if you think this is the right approach to be able to ensure that there is that type of ongoing funding to do this work.
Thank you, Mr. Wheeler, through the chair. I definitely agree that, and I was trying to convey that earlier in response to another question in terms of putting a small fee, levy, tax on the procurement of the vessel and then having that go into a bit of a slush fund that's available for remediation and restoration activities across the coast. I think that's one of the most low-hanging fruit solutions to put in place, and I totally agree with that direction. Thank you, through the chair.
And Ms. Bowman, I'd be curious on your thoughts as well.
Through the chair, Mr. Weiler, thank you for your question. Yes, I think that a small fee or a tax levy is definitely something that we should be adding to each and every vessel, and it could be when the vessel is first purchased and registered with Canadian government, like we had discussed earlier, and then that levy and like is with that boat, attached to that boat for the duration of that boat. That's a good idea, and I think that there might be other ideas through the through marinas that we could be looking at increasing some sort of taxes there that we could put into this fund as well. Thank you, Mr. Weiler, through the chair.
Thank you, Ms. Bowman. And I just want to pick up on one thing related to that. One of the, I'm not sure how it is in other provinces, but in British Columbia, we have liability, for instance, for people that have oil tanks found on their property. And it will go back multiple property owners before that. So you can ensure that if someone unknowingly is subject to pollution on their property from that there is that responsibility that goes back. So I'm curious if you might be supportive of something similar when we're talking about abandoned and derelict boats, where you do have oftentimes boat owners that will sell or transfer that boat to a new owner that won't register it. And oftentimes it's difficult to make that polluter pay if that boat will be wrecked or abandoned.
Through the chair, Mr. Weiler, was that directed at me, that question?
Yes.
Thank you. So I totally agree. And start putting the onus on somebody. And maybe that will send a strong message to people who are trying to sell their boats and not transferring that registration over. So putting an idea and a process in place such as that, I think, is a great start. Thank you, Mr. Weiler, through the chair.
Thank you very much, Ms. Bowman. And then last question I just want to ask to Ms. Dubois. Are there other jurisdictions or, whether that's at the national or subnational level around the world, that we should be looking at to adopt some of their good practices for how we can approach this issue?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Weiler, through the chair. At this time, I'm not aware of any other sort of examples or case studies that we could refer to. And just to quickly comment, I had an idea while Mrs. Bowman and was addressing the other question, just in terms of the transfership of owners. There could be a tax incentive created or something along those lines for vessel owners when they transfer their vessel that they could get or acquire that would incentivize them to report such changes or some kind of incentive model. Anyways, I'll leave it there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Waller. We'll now go to Mr. Small for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
You're welcome.
It's great to have another opportunity to present some more questions to these witnesses here. I know my colleague, Mr. Arnold, questioned earlier about the housing issue as it relates to abandoned vessels. To Ms. Dubois, how often do you encounter folks living on board these vessels because it's their only option. And how has that become a hindrance to removing derelict vessels?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Small, through the chair. We have encountered some of these vessels being lived on or squatted on, as Mrs. Bowman was also encountering and referring to today's group. However, it's very challenging to know the frequency of use of some of these vessels, the amount of support or housing that they are providing. When you look at the example of the dog patch, it's very close to the city. It's the use is very high in circumstances like that. But when we start looking into more coastal, rural communities, without monitoring, we're not sure if people are actively living on these vessels or what's happening with them. And then when they are reported abandoned, unless they're sinking, there's not much we can really do about it until they've sunk, and then we can get additional resources in place. So it's a challenging question to answer. Thank you. Through the chair.
Mr. Bois, again, so what would be the solution to the squatter issue on those abandoned vessels? Do you have any suggestion?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure how practical this is in this meeting here, but creating affordable housing for people in British Columbia would be a great start. Housing, no matter where you are across this coast, is exponentially increasing, and is very challenging to afford for the best of us. So, it's a much larger conversation and issue, I think. But to create low-income affordable housing would be a great start. Thank you.
So the housing crisis is even affecting the ability to remove abandoned vessels.
Correct. Yes.
Okay. I've got one more. I've got another question here, Mr. Waugh. How accurate do you believe the count of derelict and abandoned vessels? How accurate do you think that count is on Canada's coast and specifically on British Columbia's coast?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Small, through the chair. I believe it is significantly underestimated. I think figuring out the unit count of the amount and concentration of these vessels is very challenging, especially for submerged vessels. And I think there's probably thousands of these vessels that have not been identified through aerial survey work and that sort of thing. So I think, and I'm personally not sure of the best way to survey the quantity of the amount of vessels that are out there right now, but I know that more survey work needs to be done.
So with the availability and relatively inexpensive operation of drones, you think that technology could be deployed, and especially given from an aerial view, you can see fairly deep down into the water. Would you think that some kind of an aerial campaign would be able to identify more of these vessels?
I think it's worth exploring. I think also combining AI technology and training AI to identify certain characteristics that are common amongst derelict vessels would be incredibly beneficial as well. Also performing ROV and subsurface survey work is going to also be critical in the campaign. I think we need to look at it from the sky and from the water to get a holistic sense of what is happening on the coast. And I think there's a lot of data gaps right now as it stands.
Thank you, Mr. Small. We will now go to Mr. Hardy for 5 minutes or less.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And here's a thought. We've been talking about the problem of people finding refuge on an abandoned boat. What about the notion of actually formalizing a process by which these boats could be shelter for people who would otherwise be, in doorways in your downtown business district, And here's an additional thought. With federal support through, let's call it a housing accelerator fund that could provide some of the infrastructure necessary to support that kind of community. Ms. Bowman, what do you think of that idea?
Through the chair, Mr. Harvey, thank you. Yes, absolutely. I think that, the unhoused, they're looking for, different ways to find shelter, and these boats are that way. So having an accelerated housing fund, I think, would be a great option, and to have some of those funds go towards this area, I think would be really a good idea to look into. Thank you, Mr. Hardy, through the chair.
Thank you. Ms. Dubois, any thoughts on that?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Hardy, through the chair. I think it's worth exploring. However, I would caution living on a boat is a lot more complicated than landlocked housing solutions. I think if we are going to be putting potentially people with mental health issues, as well as people who are currently not housed in a boating environment, they need training. I also think that a lot of these abandoned boats are not suitable to live aboard. They don't have heat. They often don't have any kind of black water containment. So I would say it's worth exploring. However, if you do choose to pursue that avenue, there needs to be some pretty strict parameters in place to guide the process. Thank you.
Yes, it isn't just a matter of getting a whole bunch of boats together, but some sort of infrastructure that would support them, and that could be social infrastructure as well as physical infrastructure. What about the notion, and I'm just test flying some possible recommendations here, what about the notion of turning vessel registration over to the Insurance Corporation of BC? They have the system set up. They could basically apply the same rules on the sea as they do on the road in terms of registration, ownership, etc. I mean, if somebody finds a motor vehicle by the road with no license plates on it, it's abandoned. It's gone. They don't care who the owner is. Do you think that kind of regime would be something worth exploring in British Columbia, given that that's where it seems that we have most of the problem in Canada? We'll start with you, Ms. Dubois, and then Ms. Bowman.
Thank you for the question. Through the chair, I think that would be a really interesting model to explore. I know that it's effective with vehicle management, so I don't see why it wouldn't be effective as well with vessel management. So I think that's a great idea. Thank you, through the chair.
And Ms. Bowman?
Thank you, Mr. Hardy, through the chair. I agree. I think that's a good way to track the vessels through the insurance, and the owner, the new owners, if they're responsible owners, should be getting insurance. And so if they are able to get insurance, and then to have that tracking mechanism, and having them have it be filed through the insurance is a great idea, great option.
I would invite both of you actually to submit to us any other thoughts you have on reducing red tape, and especially to relieve the difficulties of trying to locate an owner rather than have a system whereby, if certain conditions are met, the boat is deemed abandoned and it doesn't matter who the owner is. It belongs to either the province or the municipality to do with as they need. That's all the time I need, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Hardy. We'll now go to Madame Debienne for 2.5 minutes or less, please.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Chair. I would like to ask our two witnesses to tell us how the committee could support their fields of intervention. I think they're similar but a little different. Ms. Bowman, is it just funding that's a problem, or is there all of this organizational definitions of federal bodies? I'm talking about Transport Canada for registration. I'm talking about the Coast Guard for more concrete interventions in difficult environments. I'm also talking about DFO in certain ways. So could you tell us in 2 minutes, well, 1 minute each, what your expectations are of these bodies according to our criteria?
Madame Dubois. I think that this committee, to be able to put a report in place to address the whole issue as a whole, breaking down each section, including all of the associated entities that work so hard already to help us address these issues. I think I think just putting new mechanisms in place, I think it's a whole: insurance, mitigation, prevention, removal. It's all part and parcel. Thank you, Madame Dubois, through the chair.
Madame Dubois.
Ms. Dubois?
Through the chair, I would agree with Ms. Bowman. I think it involves all levels in terms of mitigation and prevention, mitigation, removal, and it will require collaboration across all levels of government. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now go to Madame Debian for 2.5 minutes or less, please. Or did I do that? Ms. Barron. Ms. Barron for 2.5 minutes. Finish up.
Thank you, Chair.
Who?
Thank you. Ms. Dubois, my next question is for you. Can you share a little bit more with the committee around the work that you're doing and why you see firsthand how important it is that we have Indigenous stewardship and Indigenous-led work happening at the forefront of the derelict and abandoned vessels issues that we're experiencing on the West Coast?
For sure. Thank you for the question, Ms. Barron, through the chair. We work hand in hand and collaborate and co-create a lot of the cleanups that we do perform, including the ones with derelict vessels. It is absolutely critical that Indigenous communities are given or provided the resources necessary to help lead. Oftentimes, a lot of these communities lack resources or administrative capacity and can't participate in the grants that are being offered to steward their own lands. So there needs to be some mechanisms in place to ensure that there's equal opportunity for remote coastal Indigenous communities, because they know their lands like the back of their hand. They know them inside and out. They know where these vessels are. They know how close in proximity they are to their either culturally significant lands and burial sites, to traditional harvesting grounds, and need to be given the same resources, or at least the capacity built so that they can participate equally. Thank you.
Thank you. Just because I only have a short time left, I'm going to ask my next question to you as well, Ms. Dubois. The last question I have is, you'd mentioned the tax on containers, and I'm not sure if you're aware, actually I believe you are, that this committee has already done a study as well on the in direct response to the Zim Kingston spill that happened along the West Coast, and the container spills, the containers that were spilled as a result, but also looking at a more appropriate and timely plan for these spills when they do occur. You had mentioned around the tax on containers and how that would help with some essential funding to clean up these vessels. Can you expand on that a little bit more so that it's really clear for us to be able to understand for our recommendations moving forward?
Sure. Thanks for the question, Ms. Barron, through the chair. So our group has been boots on the ground, in response to a lot of these shipping container spills, as well as addressing the actions in the removal of the derelict vessels. And an idea that we had was to create a small tax or levy through the port. With every shipping container that comes in or ship, they do pay a small levy that then gets pooled into a larger fund or a pool of resources, so that when we're looking at the polluter pay principle, oftentimes it fails when the polluter doesn't pay or can't be identified. So this fund would then allow some baseline resources to be put in place so that we can respond faster. Oftentimes then when the polluter is identified, there is a lengthy administrative process that needs to occur. Those funds do not get out into the hands of communities or into the hands of experts to then remediate the pollution that is occurring from these spills. The Zim Kingston spill, the response was very delayed overall, and the whole time that we're waiting for funds to be released, materials are photodegrading and smashing against the rocks lines and getting smaller and smaller, which is not only increasing the difficulty in reclaiming these materials, but the cost of removing these materials. So we need to ensure that there's some kind of reoccurring income coming in that we can use as resources to respond to these larger scale spills that happen and will continue to keep happening as ocean traffic and transport continues to increase and trade increases on our coastline.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Barron. You turned 2.5 minutes into 4.5. Not everybody can do that, but congratulations. I want to say thank you to Mr. Waugh and Ms. Bowman for sharing their knowledge to the committee today. And as we get ready to actually give some direction on the writing of this report. So I'll allow you to sign off now, and we'll pause for a moment or suspend for a moment as we go in camera. you.